Thank you for coming out to this Czech semester presentation. I'd like to welcome the world language students from Joplin High School. Appreciate you being on our campus today. So the title of this morning's presentation, Searching for Ghosts, a journey through the history, mysteries, and haunted places of Prague. We're very fortunate to have the author of a book on Haunted Prague joining us remotely from Arlington, Virginia, Michele Patrick. Michele says that Prague is perhaps the most haunted city in the world. So I think it's an appropriate topic for a Halloween presentation. Michele Patrick is a professional writer and award-winning speechwriter living in Arlington, Virginia. Her mother was born in the former Czechoslovakia. She has a BA in economics and history from LaSalle University in Philadelphia. And she has a master's from the University of Pennsylvania, and she was also a Fulbright scholar to the University of London, where she explored the economies of Central and Eastern Europe, focusing on the former Czechoslovakia. Michele has served as a speechwriter for the President's Cabinet, the United States Senate, the presidents of the University of Pennsylvania and Georgetown University, and the heads of various governmental agencies. She was also the communications director for the 2015 White House Conference on Aging. She has visited Prague numerous times and even lived on the Old Town Square in the 1990s. Her book, Haunted Prague, Stories of Spirits, Sorcerers, and the Supernatural, came out in 2019. She just returned to her home on Thursday following a 10-day book tour. I feel fortunate that we were able to secure her for this presentation on Halloween. So please join me in welcoming Michele Patrick.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Stebbins, and thank you all for joining me today, appropriately on Halloween, for a journey through one of Europe's most hauntingly beautiful, as well as just plain haunted places. Now, what I'd like to do today is to take you on a comprehensive slideshow journey through Prague. I want to acquaint you with the beauty of this city, to discuss maybe 6 or 7 historical figures that we'll encounter along the way, whose lives really do provide an overview of Czech history, and of course, most important, to explore the city's legends, ranging from a headless horseman to dancing demons to a cursed crown to Prague's own Frankenstein monster, all of which I will discuss this morning. And with that, it's time to begin our slideshow of Haunted Prague. Now, what I'd like to do is first show you where we're going to be going today. Now, we're going to start right in the middle of the map, and that's Charles Bridge. It's the red one over the Vltava River. Then we're going to go from Charles Bridge to the right bank of the river to the Old Town, then to the Jewish Town, and ending up at the New Town, focusing on that very, very large rectangle you see there outlined in green and red. So after we finish the Old Town, the Jewish Town, and the New Town, we're going to jump across the Vltava River and go to the Lesser Town, and then climb upward through the Castle District, finally ending up at Prague Castle, which on the map you see in Czech is Hradčany, and in its apex, St. Vitus Cathedral. So to begin, we start with Prague's #1 tourist attraction, and this is Charles Bridge. It's probably the loveliest and most romantic bridge in the world, and it features those gorgeous Gothic bridge towers that you see there. Now, the bridge was built over the Vltava in 1357 by someone called Charles IV, who was the King of Bohemia and Holy Roman Emperor. And here you see Charles praying before his altar. Now, Charles was the greatest of all Czech rulers. In the 14th century, he made Prague the capital city of all of Europe, and Bohemia became the continent's most important country. Besides building the bridge, he built much of the cathedral, created the first university in all of Central Europe, and also established most of the new town. Now, much of the look of Prague, including the largest number of Gothic buildings in the world, is due to Charles. And it's said that when he died in Prague Castle, all of the city's church bells began to miraculously and simultaneously toll on their own. And here is just a lovely shot of the entire length of the bridge taken from the right bank of the river, and that is Prague Castle looming above. Now, legend says that a struggling young architect once made an unfortunate bargain with Satan in order to gain fame by rebuilding the Charles Bridge. He agrees to the bargain with the devil out of vanity and because of his wife's desire for status. Well, as you can see here, the bridge never was rebuilt, and I probably don't need to tell you that things did not turn out very well for the unlucky architect and his wife. And some of my tales today I am going to tell you in full, but some I can only sort of tease you, like with this one. If you want more details about what happened to the architect, you'll have to pick up Haunted Prague. Now, despite the legends and the beautiful architecture, the bridge's most defining feature is the collection of 30 stone statues of saints, which flank both sides, and which I think you can see in this photo. Now, my favorite of these statues is the largest on the bridge. It's this one, and it was established to commemorate a religious order which was created to free captive Christian slaves from the Turks. And in fact, if you look in that little cell at the bottom of the statue, you can actually see the slaves languishing behind bars. Now, the reason this is my favorite statue is because a number of times in the 20th century, including when Prague was liberated from the Nazis, these bars were ripped away by grateful Praguers. Now, before leaving the bridge, I want to do one more thing. I want you to notice the back of Prague Castle. And this is a shot of the castle taken from Charles Bridge. Way in the back, you see that small white tower with a conical red roof? Well, that appropriately is called the White Tower. And directly below it, although you can't see it in this photo, is this. And this is a pencil sketch of the Daliborka Tower. Now, in the Middle Ages, the Daliborka Tower was the castle's dungeon, and legend says that it was named for its first prisoner, Sir Dalibor of Kozloedy. Now, he was imprisoned because he tried to help the oppressed serfs and was condemned to death for it. However, a date for his execution was never set, and he continued to languish in the tower. One day, he, of all things, asked for a violin to while away the time. Very soon, allegedly, his playing became so miraculous that larger and larger crowds gathered each day under his window, and the magistrates were afraid to publicly touch him. This continued for quite some time. But then one day, the music suddenly stopped, and Dalibor was never heard from again. But even today, Praguers will tell you that on a quiet summer's night, you can still hear the music of a violin floating above Prague's 7 hills. I tell that story, and not because it's gruesome or frightening, although you'll definitely be hearing a number of those today, but because it's probably Prague's best loved legend. And I think because it speaks to things that Praguers truly cherish: history, music, and anyone that champions the oppressed, which they themselves were many times in later centuries. Now, a very short distance from Charles Bridge, we come to what is probably my favorite area of the city, the Old Town. Now, the heart of the Old Town is this, the Old Town Square, where, yes, I lived in the 1990s. Now, its most famous site is the Old Town Hall, which is that tall tower you see in the foreground of the photo. Now, the reason that it's so famous is because of what this tower sports on its front, the world-renowned astronomical clock. Now, here you see a photo of it, and the man who built the clock in 1490 supposedly accomplished it with supernatural powers. It was considered a true wonder of the medieval world, and tourists still mob the square for the hourly show. You see, at the top of every hour, those two windows there, they fly open, and a procession of the 12 apostles come past, blessing everyone in the square. Now, once the apostles are done their parade, a skeleton representing death rings his bell. Other figures, including a Turk, nod and move. That cock that you see at the top crows and flaps its wings. Other bells ring, and then finally the hour chimes. It is still the best show in town. And if there's any doubt about that, then all you need to do is look at this photo for a moment. And you'll see the enormous crowds gathered at the base of the clock waiting for it to start its show. Now, I want to note something about this slide before moving on. In the back, you see the enormous twin towers of Our Lady of Teen Church, each topped by 8 pointed steeples crowned by golden balls. Now, Praguers will tell you that the resident ghost of a young boy killed by his own father haunts the church, and that also this church gave Walt Disney his inspiration for Sleeping Beauty's castle. You can take a look and I'll let you decide for yourselves. Now, at the back of the church is Our Lady of Teen Courtyard, but I warn you not to wander there at night, because you may encounter one of Prague's most unfriendly spirits. Legend says that a turbaned Turk, dressed in the flowing caftans of the 16th century, with rings on every finger and carrying an immense gold jewel box, haunts the courtyard at night. Now, the gem inside his jewel box is his most prized possession, but it's not one that most people would covet. You see, the spirit was once a resident of Prague, but in a fit of jealousy, he supposedly murdered his lover for being unfaithful to him. Immediately overcome with grief, he fled the city and died of despair not long afterward. Simultaneously, a ghostly specter in flowing caftans was seen wandering Teen Courtyard at night. Unable to find peace, he continues to haunt the area even today. But if you do ignore my warning and run into him, please don't ask to see what he keeps in his jewel box. It is his lover's head. And legend says that he is always looking to add another head to his collection from anyone unfortunate or unwise enough to ask to see the box's contents. But I have to say, now that we're back in the light, anywhere you wander from the Old Town Square, you're going to find fascinating sights and fascinating legends. And before we leave the square, I just want to show you one more thing. In the center stands the larger-than-life monument to Czech religious reformer Jan Hus. Now, he fought against the wealth and corruption of the Catholic Church in the 15th century. In many ways, he began the Protestant Reformation an entire century before Martin Luther. Unfortunately, in 1415, he was burned at the stake by the church for his trouble. He remains a national hero to the Czechs even today. Now, not far from his statue and leaving the square, we come upon this. And this is the House of the Golden Well. And it shows you some of the fascinating sights throughout the old town. Now, since this is Prague, it's of course named for a legend about a housemaid who fell into the well in the cellar looking for gold. Because her employer refused to pay for her burial, she apparently still haunts the premises today. But what I want you to notice are the crossroads in front of the house. That intersection you see is supposedly where Prague's own headless horseman supposedly gallops at midnight. Now, he is a former Knights Templar who was beheaded for heresy and treason in the 15th century. Today, he rides through the area on a great white horse that breathes fire. Under one arm, he holds his head, and in the other, a great sword, which he uses to pursue anyone in his path. Now, it's said that if anyone can grab the horse's reins, seize the sword, and thrust it into the knight's heart, he will finally be able to find rest. Unfortunately, as of today, no one has been brave enough, or fast enough, or strong enough to do so. Now, interestingly, there have been more sightings of this spirit than any other of Prague's supernatural beings. But I've always wondered something. Given the number of tourist pubs in the area, if the extraordinary number of sightings has more to do with the fantasy of Czech legend or the reality of Czech beer. And then finishing up in the old town, just a few quick sights. This is the Estates Theater, where Mozart premiered his opera Don Giovanni. And this is the beautiful Neo-Renaissance museum to the father of Czech music, Bedřich Smetana, who many of you may be studying this semester. And then finally, just one of my favorite Renaissance doorways in Prague. Now, next to the old town, we move into Prague's famous Jewish quarter. And here we are looking into that quarter. Now, today, Prague's Jewish quarter contains the remnants of the city's ancient Jewish ghetto, the world-renowned Jewish Museum, which has the finest complex of Jewish historical and cultural sites in the world, and the world's largest collection of Art Nouveau buildings. And I just included two of them to give you a feel for it. Here are some beautiful Art Nouveau buildings in the quarter, and you can see a little bit of the detail, such as this wonderful statue of a woman looking at herself in the mirror. But even with all of this Art Nouveau grandeur, perhaps more than anywhere else in Prague, the Jewish ghetto retains an almost palpable sense of magic and mystery, a place of secrets and the golem, or Prague's own Frankenstein monster. So let's take a look. Now, the building you see here is the spiritual heart of the ghetto, or the Jewish quarter, and has been for 8 centuries. This is the Old New Synagogue. It was completed in 1270, and it is the oldest functioning synagogue in Europe. It's continually held services for over 750 years, except during 4 years of Nazi occupation from 1941 to 1945. It also supposedly has supernatural roots. It's said that soon after the Jewish people arrived in Prague, supposedly in 135 AD, they didn't have a place of worship, so they prayed. And one day, a legion of angels with rainbow-tipped wings suddenly appeared in the sky, carrying massive blocks of hewn stone. The angels began to set the stones down on the ground, and soon walls began to rise. One angel told the stunned community that the stones were from the shattered Temple of Jerusalem, and they were using them to build the Praguers a new house of worship, which of course today we know as the Old New Synagogue, but that they one day would come back for the stones and return them to Jerusalem at the coming of the Messiah. Now, there are more stories of the Old and New Synagogue in my book, but there's one we have to touch on, and that is Prague's golem, or as I noted, Prague's own Frankenstein monster. Now, in Jewish tradition, a golem is a creature made of clay or earth who comes to life using magic or the occult. He often appears in Jewish folktales, But only Prague's golem, a giant with fiery red eyes and superhuman strength, has achieved worldwide fame, as you can tell by the myriad of souvenirs in the tourist shop. Now, the golem was supposedly created by this man, and this is a statue of the fabled Rabbi Judah Low. The statue stands right in front of Prague's new town hall. Now, Low was actually the leading Talmudic scholar of the Renaissance, but it was said that he created this golem in order to protect the Jewish community from a pogrom. Well, the golem was able to do that, but he then became so violent that no one could control him, and Low had to imprison him in the attic of the Old New Synagogue. And here, this is a shot of the other side of the synagogue. And I hope you can notice that stairway on the outside. That is called the Stairway to Nowhere. And if you look, it does lead to a window or an arch that is completely sealed with brick and mortar. That's where the golem supposedly slumbers. There's also a newer legend that says that during the World War II, 2 Nazi officers entered the chamber to investigate and were immediately ripped to shreds. Well, you can find out more about the legends of golem in Haunted Prague. Now, even though the Old New Synagogue is truly the spiritual heart of the ghetto, its most iconic site is probably this one, and I'll give you a moment to take a look at it. This is the old Jewish cemetery. Now, it dates from 1439, and for 300 years, Jews could not be buried anywhere else in Prague. So in an area no larger than a city block, as many as 100,000 people are buried in layers up to 12 deep. It's also supposedly where Low created the golem. And here's a shot of the cemetery from another angle. It features a forest of 12,000 worn and weathered tombstones crowded together and covered with moss and age. Many, as you can see, lean wildly or fall over one another, and many are partially or almost completely submerged in the earth. If you see it, it's like a ghostly version of a lunar landscape. Now, the Jewish quarter does retain a number of other historical buildings and sites, including magnificent synagogues, all with a definite air of mystery. Now, of those sites, my favorite is this. It's probably the most beautiful synagogue, and it is the Spanish synagogue. Now, ironically, although 77,000 Czech Jews perished in the Holocaust, the historic buildings were saved because Adolf Hitler himself picked the Jewish quarter as a future location for, in his own words, an exotic museum to an extinct race. Now, our final stop on the right bank of the Vltava is the New Town. And it truly, with its shops and cafes and restaurants, it's Prague's cosmopolitan heart. Now, its centerpiece is this, Wenceslas Square, formed by the fronted by the Grand National Museum. Now, in front of that museum is this, the great equestrian statue of the Czech patron saint and 10th century ruler of Bohemia, Wenceslas. Yes, and he is of good King Wenceslas fame of the Christmas Carol. Now, I'm taking you back a slide, because Wenceslas Square is where Praguers have traditionally gathered to mourn, protest, and celebrate national events. And I need to mention 3 of them before we go on. So for only one time now during this presentation, I'm going to focus a little bit on Czech history, but I promise a very abridged history of the Czech people in the 20th century in about 3 minutes. Now, after the 14th century, the time of Charles IV, the the Czech nation declined, and it was eventually completely absorbed by the Austrian Empire by 1620. For 300 years, the Czechs suffered under Austrian oppression. But in 1918, they were able to secure their independence, and joining their sister nation, the Slovaks, they formed Czechoslovakia. At that time, Wenceslas Square was the site of euphoric celebrations. But storm clouds were gathering, and only 20 years later, England and France handed Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany through the infamous Munich Agreement, not even allowing a single Czech at the negotiating table. They hoped that the sacrifice of a small nation would ensure peace in Europe. Of course it didn't, and the Czechs suffered under Nazi tyranny for 6 years during World War II. Now, when the nation and the capital were finally liberated in 1945, Soviet-backed communists seized the government only 3 years later, and the Czechs suffered for 41 years under another brutal regime as a Soviet satellite. But there was a bright spot. In 1968, this man, Alexander Dubček, led a liberalization movement that came to be known as Prague Spring. Now, although Dubček was the country's communist leader, he was very much a reformer and granted civil rights and civil liberties. Well, the Soviet Union could not tolerate that. And so on August 21st, 1968, they invaded the country and deposed Dubček. Wenceslas Square was the focal point for furious protests against the occupation. But the Soviet might prevailed, and Czechoslovakia would suffer under communism for another 21 years, until its fall in 1989. And the fall was led by this man, the famous dissident and playwright Václav Havel. Now, the end of communism in Czechoslovakia came to be known as the Velvet Revolution, because the Czechs and Slovaks would bring down one of the most oppressive communist regimes in Europe with nonviolent action in only 10 days and without so much as breaking a window. And Wenceslas Square was again the focal point for those demonstrations that brought down communism. Now, Havel would become president of Czechoslovakia in December of 1989. And after the two nations, the Czechs and Slovaks, split so peacefully in 1992 that it became known as the Velvet Divorce, he became the very first president of today's Czech Republic. Now, much of Prague's history can be found here at the Museum of Prague, which stands at the edge of the new town. Now, I mention it because among its exhibits, there's a cast iron statue of a knight from the time of the Crusades. Now, the knight was once a living person, until he returned from the East and found that his fiancée had deserted him while he was away at war. Confronting the young woman, he became enraged and strangled her. But with her last breath, the young girl cried for vengeance, and divine retribution, as I have to say often happens in Prague, came incredibly quickly. The knight immediately turned to iron. Yet, heaven did not leave him without an opportunity to regain his mortal form. Once a year, for only one night, he's given life, but not his mortal body. And Praguers will tell you they can actually hear his iron footfalls on the cobblestones. He's allowed to wander Prague, and he will immediately regain his human form if he kisses a virgin. Unfortunately for the knight, it's said that he has not yet been able to convince a virgin to kiss him. Now, with that note, we're going to jump across the river to the lesser town and then going uphill to the Hradčany, or Prague Castle, finishing there with St. Vitus Cathedral. So we start at the lesser town, and it's very inappropriately named because it's one of Prague's most picturesque areas. And the area boasts, for example, exceptional views, such as this one, which is one of my favorites. It also boasts lavish public gardens, including the Wörth Garden, which is the finest Baroque terrace garden in Europe. Here's another shot of the Wörth, and I just love the color. And then the Wallenstein Gardens with, again, Prague Castle looming above. The area is also known for its quirky streets, such as this one, which I just love, and there's nothing special about it. It just shows you never know what you're going to find around any corner in Prague. And finally, the area, the lesser town, boasts the world's largest concentration of Baroque buildings, all nestled beneath Prague's ubiquitous red slate roofs and scattered green copper domes. Now, by far the area's largest dome, which you see in this photo, is the dome of the Church of St. Nicholas on the lesser town square. And here's another shot of it. But I also want to call attention to those two towers, those two way in the background, those two white ones. They are the towers of Strahov Monastery, which has beautiful libraries you can visit, but which also have the remains of a dodo bird. Again, proving that you'll never know what you're going to find around any corner in Prague. Now here is the final shot of St. Nicholas, which is a shot of the entire church taken from the Wörth Garden. And then its glorious interior. And you can tell why it's considered the most glorious Baroque church north of the Alps. There's also a legend that a figure of a man dressed in rags prays at the altar when the church is empty, giving thanks to St. Wenceslas for saving his life centuries ago. Now, from here, the lesser town leads upwards and uphill to the castle district, among the most atmospheric sections of Prague. Now, sights on the way includes vineyards, and I love the fact that there are vineyards in the middle of a major European city. Then we'll continue up winding Nerodova Street. And Nerodova Street is famous for its house signs, such as this one, which is the House of the Two Sons. And these signs were used to find a person or a shop before the advent of street or home addresses. Now, Nerodova leads us to the frothy Baroque wedding cake of the Loreto Chapel, with its legend of a widow and her 12 doomed children. And directly across from the Loreto Chapel, we come to this. This is the Chernin Palace, which is the largest palace in Prague. And it's a great example of the layers of history and legends that can be found in so many of Prague's buildings. You see, the Chernin Palace supposedly boasts a portal to hell right outside of it, probably where that statue stands. One time, the devil appeared and dragged good King Wenceslas's mother, Drahomira, through the portal down into hell. She, by the way, was not so good, being a pagan and a murderer. Now, when workmen were starting to excavate the foundations for this building, they actually did find a unique pre-Christian cemetery, unusual in all of Europe, where all the skeletons were found headless. Later, in the 18th century, a countess allegedly lived here who was so wicked that one night when she held a great ball, she was danced into hell by 9 identical demons. Luckily, that portal to hell was right there. And finally, during the Nazi occupation, this building was headquarters for the SS. It's just a great example of why so many of Prague's buildings are certainly the perfect settings for ghost stories. And then finally, in the castle district, right before the castle, we come to this statue. It is a statue of the still beloved and revered first president of Czechoslovakia, Tomáš Masaryk. Now, Masaryk was a committed Democrat who truly believed in the equality of all people. He led Czechoslovakia for over 17 years. And during that time, between the two world wars, the country was the only free, multi-party democracy in all of Central and Eastern Europe. And think about this. It was also, at that time, the 7th richest country in the world. Now, Masaryk appropriately faces this. Prague Castle, which floats above the city like a kingdom in the cloud. The largest inhabited castle in the world, with over 1,000 rooms, it's been the traditional seat of Czech rulers, whether kings or presidents, for over 1,100 years. And that neoclassical facade that you see there stretches for over a half-mile. Inside, the entire complex includes palaces, museums, churches, cottages, and gardens. Now, to enter, we go through the great castle gates. And right beyond, we come to my favorite room in the castle, Ladislav Hall. Now, the reason it's my favorite, well, actually 2 reasons. One is its beauty, and I just love that magnificent fan vaulting on the ceiling. The other is that this is where indoor jousts were held, so the nobility and royalty wouldn't be bothered by inclement weather. There are actually special stairs leading into this room to accommodate the horses so that the riders wouldn't even have to dismount. And behind Ladislav Hall, we come to the charming Golden Lane. Now, many tour guides in Prague will tell you that it's called the Golden Lane because this is where the alchemists, or those that tried to turn base metals into gold, this is where they lived. Well, don't believe them. These little cottages were actually where the castle's archers lived. And I hate to destroy a beautiful story, but it's called the Golden Lane because during the Middle Ages, the castle's sewer system ran downhill on either side of the lane. And so the golden liquid was not a liquid that most people would covet. But I do have to note that there were alchemists that lived in the castle, just in another area. You see, here we see the Austrian ruler, Rudolf II. And in the 16th century, he actually did make Prague the magical capital of Europe. He brought alchemists, magicians, mystics, and madmen from across Europe to his capital on the Vltava to turn base metal into gold, to discover the philosopher's stone, and to discern the secrets of the universe. More than any other reason or person, it is Rudolf that enveloped Prague in the mists of legend which have still not evaporated. Even today in Prague, Rudolf is known as the Alchemist Emperor. And finally, at the apex of Prague Castle, we come to this, the glorious St. Vitus Cathedral, where the national saint, Wenceslas, and probably the national spirit is enshrined. Now, work began on St. Vitus in 1344. Completed only in 1929, St. Vitus is recognized as one of Europe's finest Gothic cathedrals. And here we see another photo of the side of the cathedral. Now, it's also where a ghostly skeleton supposedly plays the organ. Centuries ago, a Jewish man converted to Catholicism, but when he died, he wanted to be buried with his own people, and he was in the Jewish cemetery across the Vltava. But he can't seem to find peace. Each night, just before dawn, he rises from his grave and walks to the river. There, a boat, piloted by a phantom, ferries him across. The boat then disappears. The skeleton of a priest, walks to the cathedral, slips inside, and supposedly plays the organ throughout the day, waiting to be found by anyone who has the courage to search for them. At dusk, he walks back down to the river, where the boat magically appears to ferry him back to the cemetery for his night's slumber. Now, the interior of the cathedral is also glorious, and it's famous for its stained glass, such as this one, which is behind the high altar. And here is another featuring parts of the life of Saint Wenceslas, and it was designed by the greatest of all Art Nouveau artists, the Czech, Alphonse Mucha. And this window is directly across, most appropriately, from the chapel of Saint Wenceslas. Now, Wenceslas was hacked to death by a group of men sent by his pagan brother who wanted to seize the throne. And his remains are in that little house-like structure that we see in the middle of the photo. Behind it, there is a small door that leads to a room that contains the Bohemian crown jewels and the last of our legends. Now, the most important of the jewels is this, the crown of Saint Wenceslas. And perhaps not surprising, a terrible legend has evolved around it. It is said that anyone who puts the crown on his or her head, even momentarily, will soon die an agonizing death. Well, the legend was perhaps last tested or proved in 1942. Reinhard Heydrich was installed by Adolf Hitler as Reichsprotector of Bohemia and Moravia to prove that he was master of all the Czechs. One time, he momentarily put the crown on his head and laughed. A few days later, he was assassinated by Czech commandos. He was the only high-ranking Nazi to be assassinated during the war. Coincidence? Curse? I'll let you decide. Well, I hope you enjoyed those legends, and I just want to leave you with a farewell slide of Prague. It's a wonderful balloon floating above a stream near the Charles Bridge. Now, this slideshow may have provided a glimpse of Prague's beauty, and certainly a taste of its legends, but it can't demonstrate why Prague really is the most haunted city in the world. And I just want to finish by leaving the slides for a moment and just giving you a little brief idea of why Prague is the most haunted city in the world. Now, I believe it's because of the importance of legends to the Czech people. You see, although it may seem like many of Prague's legends are very dark and they talk about people who are still haunting the places where they were persecuted or murdered, in actuality, most of Prague's legends actually hinge on values such as faithfulness, honesty, compassion, bravery, kindness, and of course, never making a pact with the devil. In other words, your moral compass must be your guide. When you lose that moral compass, all will be lost. But if you maintain your moral compass, your most important weapon against the forces of darkness, there is hope and even confidence that in the end, you will eventually not simply survive, but triumph. Now you see, this was an extremely important message to the Czech people. Living in the geographic center of Europe, for centuries, dictators, invasions, and wars washed over them, and they needed to hold on to the belief that their own innate virtues and values, their own moral compass, would ultimately ensure their survival as nations. Legends told them that, and that's why they're so important to the Czech people. I hope you've enjoyed this glimpse of Prague, and that it's piqued your interest to find out more about its legends, about this mysterious and magical place, and yes, about the 40 stories of spirits, sorcerers, and the supernatural that do appear in my book. Thank you so much for joining me today.
A quick question before we go. Today is Halloween.
Yes.
Prague is 7 hours ahead of us, so it's 7 o'clock in the evening. How does Prague celebrate Halloween? Are people dressed in costume? Is there any trick-or-treating? I assume maybe there are some ghost tours going on. Could you just give us a quick overview of how Prague would be celebrating Halloween this evening?
That is a great question. And Prague, because of globalization, Prague is now celebrating Halloween in many ways like we would. My husband and I were in Florence about 7 years ago, and they were celebrating it in the same way. Yes, there is trick-or-treating. There would be Halloween parties. There would be many ghost tours. But the costumes that both children, but particularly adults, would dress in would be much more of the sinister and the macabre. Than necessarily the fantasy and the fun. But this is new. When I was in Prague in the 90s, they were not celebrating Halloween yet. But again, it's come from globalization. Traditionally in Prague and the Czech Republic, because of the Roman Catholic calendar, they would be getting ready to celebrate All Souls Day, All Saints Day tomorrow. So they would celebrate All Souls Day in remembering those that had gone before, and then celebrating All Saints Day again to remember all those that had gone before. So in many ways, yes, trick-or-treating or Halloween in Prague would look like trick-or-treating or Halloween in the United States.
Okay. Well, thank you, Michele, for an excellent presentation and enlightening us about the ghosts and the spirits and the sorcerers of Prague. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.